My name is Valerie, and I am 28 years old. But on that night, I felt like an unwanted stranger in the home I had carefully maintained for years. The heavy silence broke the moment my younger sister slammed her glass onto the table to declare that she required my bedroom for her live streaming career, because the natural lighting was superior to her current setup. She looked me in the eye while demanding that I move my belongings into the damp basement so she could have a better aesthetic for her online followers. My mother continued cutting her steak without raising her eyes as she casually remarked that I was being incredibly selfish for holding on to the master suite instead of sacrificing my comfort to support my sister's future. When I attempted to defend myself by reminding them that I paid every single utility bill, my father slammed his fist against the mahogany table with enough force to make the silverware rattle violently. He threw a dusty blue folder toward me while shouting that the property belonged to him, according to a will he had supposedly just discovered. He leaned forward with a vein pulsing in his neck to deliver a cruel ultimatum that I must pack my belongings and get out of his house before 7 in the morning. I picked up the folder without shedding a single tear because a cold determination had suddenly replaced my sadness. That night, I decided to do something absolutely shocking that would leave them screaming in horror when they opened the front door the next morning. Before we continue with what happened next, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you support justice. Tell me in the comments if you think family betrayal hurts the most so I know you are listening. To understand why I could remain so incredibly composed while holding that fraudulent eviction notice, you must first understand that this house never truly belonged to them in any moral or legal sense. I had lived within these Victorian walls with my grandmother, Grandma Elsie, since I was 6 years old, while my biological parents and Sabrina lived comfortably in another state. They rarely visited us during those 2 decades because they were too busy chasing a lavish lifestyle in Florida that eventually crumbled around them. My childhood memories are filled with the scent of my grandmother's baking and her gentle voice reading to me by the fireplace rather than the presence of the people who gave birth to me. The nightmare began only 6 months ago when my grandmother passed away and my parents suddenly remembered they had a daughter living in a valuable property in Vermont. They did not move in immediately because they were still entangled with their failing business in the South, but they began treating my home like their future retirement plan while hiding the fact that they were facing total bankruptcy. I discovered their financial ruin through overdue bank notices that accidentally arrived at my address, but I kept that knowledge to myself to avoid embarrassing them. They started showing up on weekends with an entitlement that made my stomach turn, acting as if they were the lords of the manor while I was merely a temporary caretaker. I remember coming home from a long shift at the hospital one Tuesday afternoon to find a white van parked on the front lawn and the front door standing wide open. The sound of industrial drills was tearing through the peaceful silence that I had always cherished in this house. I rushed inside with my heart pounding against my ribs to find 3 strangers stripping the vintage floral wallpaper that my grandmother had loved so dearly. They were covering the warm history of the living room with a cold and soulless shade of gray paint that made the house feel like a prison. When I demanded to know who authorized this destruction, the foreman simply pointed to the backyard where Sabrina was filming a video on her phone. Sabrina was directing another group of workers who were hauling my grandmother's antique velvet armchair toward a rented dumpster, as if it were nothing more than garbage. I ran outside and physically grabbed the chair to stop them screaming at my sister to explain why she was destroying our heritage. She barely looked up from her screen as she told me that the furniture was hideous and she needed a modern aesthetic for her social media background. She called the precious items that I had grown up with trash that was ruining the property value and claimed she was doing me a favor by modernizing the place. When I tried to kick the workers out, Mom arrived and immediately launched into a rehearsed speech about how I was overreacting to a simple home improvement project. She stood there in her designer coat and told me that Dad only wanted to upgrade the house so we could all live comfortably together in the future. She used the same manipulative tactics she had always used by claiming that family means sharing everything without keeping score or asking for permission. She looked me in the eye and said I should be grateful that they were willing to invest time and energy into fixing up what she called a dilapidated old shack. I wanted to scream at them to leave and never come back, but I swallowed my rage because I had made a promise to my grandmother on her deathbed. She had begged me to try and maintain a relationship with my parents because she believed that people could change if given enough love and patience. I held on to that promise for 6 agonizing months while watching them chip away at the soul of my home piece by piece. I paid the bills while they spent their money on expensive dinners and cosmetic renovations that I never asked for. However, their behavior at dinner tonight proved that their greed had finally eclipsed any shred of familial love they might have pretended to possess. They did not want a relationship with me. They wanted the house, the assets, and the freedom to erase my existence whenever it became inconvenient for them. The moment Roger threatened to kick me out of the home I legally owned was the moment my promise to Grandma was fulfilled and subsequently broken. I had tried my best to be the dutiful daughter they expected, but they had pushed me past the point of no return. That night, the wind was howling outside the window, signaling a massive snowstorm approaching Burlington, which perfectly mirrored the turbulent atmosphere inside my dining room. The heavy mahogany table was covered in greasy takeout containers because my mother refused to cook in what she called my outdated kitchen, even though she had no problem eating the food I paid for. The conversation had started with casual complaints about the weather, but quickly shifted when Sabrina wiped her mouth with a napkin and looked at me with the predatory gaze of someone who had never been denied anything in her life. She casually announced that she had spent the afternoon measuring the dimensions of my master suite, while I was busy preparing the table for dinner. The air in the room seemed to freeze when Sabrina pointed a manicured finger at the ceiling and declared, "I have decided that your room is the only one suitable for my studio, because the basement lighting makes me look washed out, so you need to move downstairs tonight." I sat there in stunned silence as she detailed her plans to paint over the vintage molding and install soundproofing foam that would ruin the historic integrity of the walls. She looked me dead in the eye and suggested that I should move my belongings down to the unfinished basement because the damp concrete floor would be good enough for someone who spent most of their time at the hospital anyway. I felt a surge of indignation rising in my chest as I looked at my parents for support, only to find them nodding in agreement with her ridiculous demands. I stared at her in disbelief and replied, "You cannot possibly be serious about evicting me from my own bedroom when I am the one who paid for every single renovation in that space." Sabrina leaned back in her chair with a smug expression and said that I was completely wasting that premium space because I did not create content for the internet. I reached into my bag to pull out the stack of utility bills I had retrieved from the mailbox earlier that day and laid the documents showing the property tax and heating payments directly onto the table. I told them firmly that I was the one keeping the lights on and the furnace running in this house, while they contributed absolutely nothing to the household expenses. Mom rolled her eyes while brushing the documents onto the floor and snapped, "Stop being such a selfish brat, Valerie, because your sister actually has a chance to be famous, and you should be grateful to support her instead of acting like a greedy landlord." She looked at me with deep disappointment and told me that money was the only thing I ever cared about while my sister was trying to build a legitimate career. She scolded me for being so calculated and cold toward my own flesh and blood over a simple room assignment. I attempted to argue that paying the mortgage gave me rights, but Dad decided to end the conversation by forcefully slamming his fist against the table and startling everyone into silence. He reached under his chair to produce the dusty blue folder that I had seen earlier and tossed it toward me with a triumphant sneer. He claimed it was a handwritten codicil to Grandma Elsie's will that appointed him as the sole administrator and beneficiary of the estate because he was the eldest son. He stood up from the table with his face turning a deep shade of red as he pointed a trembling finger directly at my face to deliver his final judgment. Dad leaned forward until I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath and shouted, "This house belongs to me as the eldest son, so you have until 7 tomorrow morning to pack your trash and get out of my sight." I looked at the three of them standing there with their arms crossed and realized that any further attempt to reason with them would be a waste of my breath. They had convinced themselves that this robbery was actually their birthright, and nothing I said would change their delusional narrative. They decided not to stay the night because the house was too cluttered for their taste, and they wanted to sleep in the comfort of their hotel room before the big move. They grabbed their coats and walked out the front door without clearing a single plate from the table because they believed that cleaning up was the duty of the subordinate family member. I stood in the center of the kitchen and listened to the sound of their car engine fading away into the snowy night. They left believing that I was a defeated woman who would spend the night crying and packing her life into cardboard boxes to accommodate their greed. They had absolutely no idea that by leaving me alone in the house for the next 10 hours, they had given me the perfect opportunity to orchestrate their downfall. 30 minutes after the red taillights of their car had finally disappeared into the swirling white darkness of the snowstorm, I picked up my phone with a hand that was trembling not from fear but from the sheer adrenaline of what I was about to do. The house felt strangely quiet without their oppressive presence filling the rooms, yet the silence was also heavy with the anticipation of the irreversible actions I was about to take against my own flesh and blood. I unlocked my screen and dialed the private number of Mr. Henderson, who had been my grandmother's trusted attorney for over 40 years and was the only person who knew the full extent of the legal protections she had put in place for me. He answered on the second ring despite the late hour because he had been expecting this specific phone call ever since my parents started showing up unannounced 6 months ago to inspect the property. I took a deep breath to steady my voice against the rising tide of emotion and said, "Mr. Henderson, they just tried to evict me using a fraudulent codicil they claim to have found, so I need you to activate Plan B immediately." The lawyer let out a heavy sigh on the other end of the line before assuring me that the paperwork was already prepared and that he would file the necessary motions first thing in the morning to ensure the police recognized my sole ownership. He told me to proceed with securing the property and to document everything before I left, promising that by noon tomorrow their little charade would be legally dismantled. Once I hung up the phone, I grabbed a single large suitcase from the hallway closet and began the selective process of packing only the items that held genuine sentimental or monetary value. I carefully wrapped Grandma Elsie's vintage pearl necklace and her diamond engagement ring in soft velvet before placing them securely in a hidden compartment of my bag alongside my birth certificate and the original deed to the house. I walked past the expensive leather sofas and the mahogany dining table without a second glance because I wanted to leave them a fully furnished house that they could look at, but not actually enjoy. My next stop was the central control panel in the hallway, which governed the entire smart security system I had installed last year using my own savings from the hospital. I navigated to the user management screen and felt a cold surge of satisfaction as I selected the profiles labeled Mom and Dad before permanently deleting their fingerprint data and access codes from the system. I programmed a new master code that was a random string of numbers only I would know and set the system to a lockdown mode that would require physical override keys that only I possessed. My revenge continued as I turned my attention to the internet router sitting in the living room, which was the absolute lifeline for Sabrina's entire existence and her delusional career aspirations. I logged into the administrator portal on my laptop and changed the network name to a message that they would understand while setting a complex password that she would never be able to guess in a million years. I knew that without high-speed internet to stream her videos or upload her content, the house would become instantly useless to her, and her tantrums would be unbearable for my parents to handle. I then pulled up the utility company websites on my phone and scheduled an immediate suspension of services for both electricity and water, starting at 6 in the morning under the pretext of emergency maintenance. I imagined the look on my mother's face when she tried to turn on the faucet to make her morning coffee, only to be greeted by a hollow, gurgling sound from the dry pipes and the inability to flush the toilets. The final and most devastating step of my plan involved the heavy iron thermostat dial that controlled the central heating for the entire Victorian structure, which was essential for survival during a Vermont winter. I walked down the hallway feeling the warmth that currently filled the house and knowing that it was about to be replaced by the biting cold that was waiting outside. I reached out and turned the dial all the way down to the lowest possible setting and listened as the comforting hum of the furnace sputtered and died into an eerie silence. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly below freezing, and without the heat running, this large house would transform into a glorified icebox within a matter of hours. I stood there for a moment in the cooling air and realized that I was not just turning off the heat, but I was extinguishing the last bit of warmth I had ever held for the people who were supposed to love me. The clock struck 3 in the morning as the headlights of my best friend's pickup truck swept across the living room window like a lighthouse beacon cutting through the thick snowfall. I stood in the darkened hallway surrounded by the last few boxes of my personal belongings, while the temperature inside the house continued to plummet toward freezing. My best friend Candace jumped out of the driver's seat wearing a thick parka and immediately started trudging through the knee-deep snow to reach the front porch where I was waiting. She stomped the snow off her heavy boots before stepping into the foyer, and her breath immediately formed a visible cloud of white mist in the frigid air of the entryway. Candace looked around the shadowy living room with wide eyes and rubbed her gloved hands together to generate some warmth before turning to look at me with concern. She could feel that the house was unnaturally cold for an occupied residence, and she knew that my plan was already in full motion. "It feels absolutely freezing in here already, Valerie, so please tell me you did not actually break the furnace before we even managed to get your boxes out to the truck." Candace whispered loudly in the silence. I shook my head and picked up a crate full of books while explaining. "The furnace is simply sleeping, just like they will wish they were doing when they walk into this icebox in a few hours." We worked in a rhythmic silence to carry the remaining items out to her truck because we wanted to conserve our energy against the biting wind that was whipping around the corners of the house. Every time we opened the front door to carry a load out, the storm seemed to scream its disapproval, but the physical labor kept my blood pumping despite the dropping mercury. Once the final box was securely strapped into the covered bed of her truck, we returned inside for one final inspection of the property to ensure everything was set perfectly. The house looked exactly as it always did, with the furniture arranged perfectly and the artwork hanging on the walls, but the soul of the place had been completely extinguished along with the utilities. Candace paused by the door with her hand on the frame and looked at me with a serious expression that told me she was worried about the magnitude of what I was doing. She knew that once I walked out this door, there would be no turning back, and the bridge between me and my family would be incinerated forever. "Valerie, are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this right now, considering that the blizzard outside is getting dangerous and you are effectively making yourself homeless?" she asked with genuine fear in her voice. I looked at the walls that had sheltered me for 20 years, and then at the dark stairs leading up to the room my sister felt entitled to steal. I felt no hesitation in my heart, only a cold resolve that matched the winter storm raging outside. I looked her in the eye and replied firmly, "I am not running away, Candace. I am simply returning exactly what they deserve to them, a completely hollow shell of a home." I turned away from her and walked into the kitchen, where the moonlight was spilling across the granite countertops that my father claimed to own. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thick white envelope that contained the documents that would eventually seal their fate. I placed the sealed envelope directly in the center of the kitchen table, where it would be the very first thing they saw when they walked into the room to complain about the cold. It sat there like a white flag of surrender that was actually a declaration of war, stark and bright against the dark wood of the table. Next to the envelope, I deliberately placed the heavy brass keychain that held the keys to the front door, the back door, and the garage. These were the keys I had used since high school, but they were now completely useless pieces of metal because I had replaced the cylinder cores of the locks weeks ago without telling a soul. I arranged them neatly so they looked like an offering of compliance, knowing that my father would feel a surge of victory when he saw them right before he realized they opened absolutely nothing. I took one last look around the kitchen where I had learned to bake with Grandma Elsie and felt a single pang of sadness that was quickly replaced by the memory of my mother's cruel words at dinner. I walked back to the front door where Candace was waiting and stepped out into the swirling snow without looking back over my shoulder. I pulled the heavy oak door shut and listened to the satisfying click of the lock as it engaged, sealing the house like a tomb. We climbed into the truck, and as we drove away, I watched the house disappear into the darkness of the rearview mirror, knowing it was now a cold, dark fortress isolated from the world. I had left them the structure they coveted so much, but I had taken the light, the warmth, and the access, leaving them nothing but a freezing monument to their own greed. At exactly 7:05 the next morning, the heavy tires of a rented moving truck rumbled into the snow-covered driveway of the Victorian estate with a sense of entitlement that disturbed the peaceful winter silence. My parents and sister climbed out of the warm cab with the triumphant energy of conquerors who were finally arriving to claim their spoils of war after a long battle. Sabrina was already dressed in a stylish but impractical outfit for the weather because she was holding her smartphone at arm's length to record her introduction for a new house tour vlog. She spun around in the driveway with a fake smile plastered on her face while telling her followers that she was finally moving into the dream studio she had always deserved. They approached the massive front porch with confident strides, completely unaware that they were walking into a fortress that had been stripped of every single comfort they took for granted. Dad marched up to the front door first and punched his personal 4-digit code into the smart keypad with an arrogant confidence, expecting the heavy oak door to swing open immediately. The small light on the electronic lock blinked an angry red color instead of the welcoming green he expected to see, signaling that access was undeniably denied. He frowned in confusion and pulled out his ring of keys to try the mechanical deadbolt, but the key refused to turn inside the cylinder because I had swapped the core weeks ago without telling them. He jiggled the key violently and slammed his shoulder against the wood, but the door remained immovable and completely sealed against his intrusion. The frustration on his face quickly morphed into a dangerous shade of purple as he realized that his authority was being challenged by an inanimate object. He slammed his fist against the solid wood of the doorframe and screamed at the top of his lungs. "You little brat, did you change the code? Open this door right now, or you will regret it." Mom tried to peer through the frosted windows and suggested that I might have fallen asleep or changed the locks by accident, but her voice lacked any real conviction. Dad lost his temper completely when Sabrina complained that her hands were getting cold, and he stormed back to the truck to retrieve a heavy sledgehammer from his toolbox. He marched around to the back entrance of the house where the glass paneling was more vulnerable and smashed the locking mechanism with a violent strike that sent splinters of wood and glass flying onto the snowy porch. He had absolutely no idea that the silent alarm system had just been triggered by the impact and was currently sending high-definition video footage of his break-in directly to the cloud for my lawyer to review. They stomped into the kitchen expecting the warmth of a heated home to thaw their frozen limbs, but they were greeted by air that was significantly colder than the outdoors, because the insulation was trapping the freezing temperatures inside. Sabrina reached for the light switch to illuminate her video introduction, but the crystal chandelier above the dining table remained dark because the electricity had been severed at the source hours ago. Mom went to the sink to fill the kettle for tea, but when she turned the handle, the faucet only produced a hollow, gurgling sound that echoed eerily in the silent room. Sabrina shivered violently in her thin coat and looked around the shadowy room with growing panic before shouting, "Why is it absolutely freezing in here, and why won't the lights turn on for my video?" Then their eyes landed on the only object that broke the emptiness of the granite countertop: the stark white envelope sitting alone in the center of the kitchen table like a tombstone. Sabrina snatched it up before Dad could reach it and tore open the seal with frantic fingers, desperate to understand what was happening to her dream studio. She pulled out the documents and let out a piercing scream that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being as her eyes scanned the bold text on the front page. She threw the papers onto the table and shrieked, "She sold it. She actually sold the house to a charity foundation, and the sale is already pending." Dad grabbed the other paper, which was the notarized copy of Grandma Elsie's real will, and his face turned the color of ash as he realized his forgery had been exposed. They stood there in the freezing darkness of the kitchen, surrounded by the physical evidence of their defeat, while the temperature continued to drop around them. 2 hours later, the wailing sirens of police cruisers tore through the quiet morning air of the suburban neighborhood, effectively ending the standoff that had been brewing inside the freezing house. My father had made the incredibly foolish decision to call the authorities because his arrogance blinded him to the reality that he was the criminal in this situation. He genuinely believed that he could manipulate the officers into forcing me to turn the utilities back on by painting himself as the victim of elder abuse. Officer Miller was the first responder to arrive at the scene, and he stepped out of his patrol car with a stern expression that suggested he had very little patience for domestic disputes on such a bitterly cold morning. He walked up the driveway past the moving truck and immediately noticed the shattered glass and splintered wood on the back porch, where Dad had used the sledgehammer to force his entry. I pulled up to the curb just a few moments later in Mr. Henderson's black sedan, and we stepped out into the snow just as Officer Miller was entering the kitchen through the broken door. The scene inside the kitchen was pathetic, as my parents and Sabrina were huddled together in their winter coats, while shivering violently against the kitchen island. Dad immediately rushed toward the officer with his finger pointed accusingly at me and started shouting about how I had tried to freeze them to death by maliciously cutting the power lines. He waved his fake blue folder in the air and demanded that I be arrested immediately for endangering his family and locking him out of his own property. Officer Miller held up a hand to silence my father's tirade and looked around at the destroyed doorframe and the general state of the house. He turned his attention to me and Mr. Henderson as we walked calmly into the room with the confidence of people who held every single winning card in the deck. Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses and opened his briefcase to reveal the pristine notarized documents that proved without a shadow of a doubt who the real owner of the estate was. Mr. Henderson stepped forward and spoke with a calm authority that instantly silenced the room. "Officer Miller, I would like to inform you that my client is the sole legal owner of this estate, and these individuals are currently trespassing and destroying private property." My father gasped in outrage and tried to interrupt, but Officer Miller took the documents from Mr. Henderson and began to review them with a professional scrutiny that made sweat bead on Dad's forehead. The officer compared the official property deed and the certified will against the handwritten coffee-stained papers that my father was clutching so desperately. It only took a few seconds for a seasoned law enforcement professional to recognize that my father's documents were crude forgeries that would never hold up in a court of law. Officer Miller looked at the video footage I had pulled up on my tablet, which clearly showed Dad swinging the sledgehammer against the door, while the electronic lock flashed red. Sabrina suddenly realized that the tide was turning against them, and she pulled out her phone to start a live stream in a desperate attempt to weaponize public sympathy. She held the camera up to her tear-stained face and began wailing to her followers that the police were conspiring with her evil sister to throw her out into the snowstorm. She screamed about injustice and corruption, hoping that her internet fame would somehow override the legal statutes of the state of Vermont. Officer Miller turned to her with a look of absolute zero tolerance and ordered her to lower the device immediately or face charges for interfering with a police investigation. Sabrina choked on her fake tears and lowered the phone as the reality of her situation finally crashed down on her privileged worldview. The officer turned back to my parents and handed the real deed back to Mr. Henderson before crossing his arms over his chest. He looked directly at my father and said, "Sir, you have exactly 15 minutes to remove your personal belongings and your vehicle from this property before I place you under arrest for breaking and entering." My mother let out a gasp of horror and looked at me with pleading eyes, hoping that I would step in and save them from the humiliation they had brought upon themselves. She tried to play the family card one last time by whispering that I couldn't possibly do this to my own flesh and blood in the middle of winter. I simply looked at her without blinking and reminded her that they were the ones who had given me a deadline of 7 in the morning to leave. The humiliation was palpable as they were forced to march out of the house under the watchful eye of the police officer while the neighbors watched from their windows. They climbed back into their rented truck with their heads hung low, defeated not by my cruelty, but by the consequences of their own insatiable greed. 6 months have passed since that snowstorm washed away the remnants of the past, and I can finally say that the silence in my life is no longer heavy with dread, but light with absolute freedom. The sale of the Victorian estate in Burlington was finalized within weeks of the incident, and I made a decision that would ensure my parents never saw a single cent of the equity they so desperately coveted. I listed the property for a fair price to a lovely young couple who promised to restore the vintage wallpaper and treat the home with the respect it deserved, rather than stripping it for parts. When the substantial check for the proceeds finally cleared in my bank account, I did not keep the money for myself because I wanted to sever every possible financial link to that chapter of my life. I took the entire sum of the inheritance and donated it to a local charitable foundation dedicated to providing housing and medical care for elderly citizens who had been abandoned by their families. It was the perfect tribute to Grandma Elsie, who had been neglected by her own son, and it was the ultimate act of revenge against my father, who valued money above human connection. I sent a photocopy of the tax-deductible donation receipt to the address of the cheap motel where my parents were staying, just to let them know that their birthright was gone forever. My parents are currently living in a state of absolute ruin because their attempt to break into my home exposed their location to the aggressive creditors they had been hiding from for months. They lost the security deposit on the moving truck due to the damage Roger caused with the sledgehammer, and they were swiftly evicted from their previous apartment for non-payment of rent. They are currently residing in a cramped roadside motel room on the outskirts of town, where they spend their days blaming me for their misfortunes, instead of taking responsibility for their greed. Sabrina fared no better because I decided to counter her false narrative by uploading the high-definition security footage of her screaming at the police officer to the very same social media platform she used to bully me. The internet community did not react kindly to seeing an entitled influencer trying to steal her sister's home in the middle of winter, and her follower count evaporated almost overnight along with her sponsorship deals. She was forced to trade her ring light for a grease-stained apron, and she now works double shifts as a waitress at a local diner to make ends meet. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she often complains to customers about her evil sister. But nobody listens to a girl who was caught on camera demanding a house she didn't pay for. As for me, I packed up the few sentimental items I had saved and moved 2 states away to a coastal town where the winters are mild and the people do not know my last name. I used my personal savings to buy a modest cottage near the ocean, and for the first time in my life,